The moment Aaron Boone rode into Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1882, his eyes found Ida Kingsley before his horse had even slowed to a stop, and something old and broken inside him stirred with a violence he had not permitted himself in years. She was standing outside the general store on Main Street with a bolt of blue calico tucked under one arm and a list in her other hand, reading it with such complete concentration that she did not notice the 5 men on horseback who had just turned the corner and were moving too fast down the center of the road for a town that had posted a clear ordinance against it. Aaron saw the situation before it fully formed. He pulled his reins left, nudged his chestnut mare hard, and positioned himself between the riders and the woman just as the lead horse shied and sprayed a wave of mud across the boardwalk. Ida Kingsley stepped back and pressed herself against the store front. She was not screaming, which surprised him. Most women he had encountered in moments like that either screamed or fainted. She did neither. She looked directly at the riders with an expression of controlled fury that Aaron found immediately unreasonably compelling. "Watch your pace in town," she said clearly, her voice carrying over the diminishing thunder of hooves as the men slowed and turned to look at her with the particular contempt men on horses sometimes showed women on foot. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a sun-ruined face and a hat that had seen too many storms, looked as though he intended to say something cutting back. Aaron did not give him the opportunity. He turned his mare to face them squarely and said nothing. He simply looked at the man. Something in that look communicated what words would have taken longer to accomplish. The riders moved on. Ida watched them go, then looked up at the man on the chestnut mare. He had a weathered face that was not unhandsome, dark eyes set under straight brows, and a jawline that suggested he had not shaved in 3 or 4 days. He wore a long coat that had been good once and trail clothes beneath it that were clean but showed serious use. There was a marshal's badge pinned to the lapel of his coat, though it was turned slightly sideways, as though he had put it on in a hurry or had some ambivalence about wearing it at all. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was different now, quieter, and had warmth in it that had not been there a moment before. "No need," he said, which was the kind of reply that was both true and insufficient, and he seemed to know it because he stayed where he was for a moment before dismounting. That was how it began between Aaron Boone and Ida Kingsley, with mud on a boardwalk and 5 horses that had no manners, on an April afternoon when the Kansas sky was the particular shade of pale blue that made everything beneath it look more significant than it was. Aaron had come to Caldwell on assignment from the Sedgwick County Marshal's office. Caldwell was a cattle town, sitting right on the Kishom Trail, and it had been through hard seasons of lawlessness that had exhausted 3 previous marshals and killed 1. The current acting marshal was a man named Holt Devereaux, who was 63 years old, walked with a cane, and had the kind of institutional wisdom that no longer included any desire to enforce anything that required physical risk. He needed help. Aaron was that help. He was 31 years old, had been a lawman in one capacity or another since he was 24, and carried a reputation in Kansas that preceded him in ways he had stopped finding useful some years back. He was also a man with a silence at the center of him that most people could feel without being able to name. It was the kind of silence that came not from having nothing to say, but from having decided, firmly and finally, not to say certain things. Ida Kingsley was 26 years old. She had come to Caldwell from Illinois 2 years prior with her father, Clement Kingsley, who had purchased a modest parcel of farmland on the eastern edge of town with the intention of growing wheat and raising hogs. Her father was still alive but not well, and Ida had been managing most of the farm's daily operations since the previous autumn when his health had begun its quiet decline. She was not what Caldwell would have called glamorous, but she was the kind of beautiful that deepened the more time you spent looking, with dark auburn hair and green eyes that could be warm and searching in the same breath, and a quality of attention in her face that made you feel, when she looked at you, that you were the only solid thing in her field of vision. She was also independent in a way that was not fashionable in Caldwell in 1882, and not everyone admired it. She made her own decisions about the farm. She handled her own accounts at the general store. She did not go to church with the regularity that Mrs. Devereux felt was appropriate for a young woman in her situation. She read books from the lending library that some of the older ladies in town considered unsuitable. She was, in the view of at least 3 of the town's more established residents, in need of guidance. Ida's own view was that she was in need of about 40 more hours in each week, and a reliable hired hand who did not disappear when haying season got difficult. Aaron checked in with Holt Devereux that first afternoon, received a brief and colorful education in the current state of Caldwell's troubles, which included a recurring gang of cattle thieves operating out of the territory south of town, a dispute between 2 neighboring ranchers that had already produced 2 fistfights and 1 knife wound, and the general fraying of civic patience that followed a long winter. He was given the deputy's room above the jail, which was small and smelled of old pipe smoke, and he spent the first evening there unpacking his few belongings and listening to the town settle into its night sounds. He did not think about Ida Kingsley. Or rather, he did think about her briefly, as he thought about any detail of a new place that his instincts flagged as significant, which was a way of thinking that felt professional and therefore acceptable. He remembered the calm in her face when the horses came too close, and the gratitude in her voice after, and then he set it aside and went to sleep. He saw her again 2 days later at the Kingsley farm. He had ridden out to the eastern farms as part of his general orientation to the territory, wanting to know where the properties were and who occupied them, the kind of geography that mattered when you needed to understand who might have seen something or who might need help. The Kingsley farm was on a gentle rise with a low barn and a farmhouse that was solid but plainly built, and there was a kitchen garden that was only just beginning to show signs of the season. 2 hogs were in a pen near the barn. A horse of advanced years and uncertain temperament stood in a small corral regarding Aaron with deep suspicion. Ida was on the roof of the barn. She had a hammer in her hand and several shingles on the roof beside her, and she was replacing a section near the peak that had clearly suffered over the winter. She did not look down as he rode up to the fence. She was focused on her work with that same quality of complete attention he had noticed before. "Miss Kingsley," he said. She looked down. Recognition moved across her face, followed by something that might have been pleasure and might have been mere acknowledgement. It was difficult to tell from the ground. "Deputy Boone," she said. She had learned his name then. He was not sure why that detail pleased him. "You should have someone up there with you," he said, "in case you fall." "I have been on this roof twice before," she said. "Once in November when a branch came down, once in February during the ice. If I waited for someone to be with me, the barn would be open to the sky." He considered that for a moment. "Do you have anyone who could help?" "My father is not well enough for roof work," she said, "and the Hawkins boy who helped us last autumn left with his family for Colorado in March." She said it without self-pity, which he appreciated. It was just a fact, and she delivered it as such. "I can help," he said, before he had decided to say it. She looked at him with a kind of measured consideration that he would come to know well over the following weeks. It was the look she used when assessing whether an offer was genuine or whether it came with costs she had not budgeted for. "You are the new deputy," she said. "Do deputies fix roofs?" "This one does, when there is not currently a crime being committed," he said. He thought he saw the edge of a smile. "Then you had better tie up your horse," she said. He spent 3 hours on that roof. She handed him shingles and nails, and he worked in silence mostly, and she did not fill the quiet with conversation for the sake of it, which he found was a quality he had not known he valued until he encountered it. When they had finished the section and climbed down, she brought him water from the well, cold and clean, and he drank it standing by the fence while she surveyed the barn roof with satisfaction. "That will hold through the summer," he said. "I believe so," she said. Then, after a moment, "My father would want to thank you himself. He is resting now, but if you are willing, you could come to supper this evening." He said he was willing. That supper was a thing he would remember for the rest of his life as one of those evenings that arrive without ceremony and establish themselves permanently in the architecture of memory. Clement Kingsley was a thin man with a scholar's face who had come west with ideas about land and space and freedom that the actual prairie had tested thoroughly, and he had emerged from that testing with a dry humor and a genuine intelligence that Aaron liked immediately. He asked Aaron direct questions about his work and listened to the answers without the usual performance of polite interest. He had been a school teacher in Illinois before the land fever took him. He knew a remarkable amount about a remarkable range of things, and he was openly proud of Ida without being patronizing about her, which was something Aaron also noticed. Ida cooked, which was competent and good without being showy. Beef stew with root vegetables and cornbread, and a dried apple pie afterward that was the kind of thing that rewarded patience. She served without ceremony and sat down with them as an equal participant in the conversation, not hovering at the edges of it, and when Aaron said something she disagreed with about the railroad's expansion into the territory, she said so clearly and made a case that he found himself genuinely considering. He rode home in the dark with the feeling that something had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the landscape of his interior life. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. Aaron's official duties kept him occupied through most days and into the evenings. The cattle thief problem proving to be more organized than Holt Devereaux had indicated, with a man named Vic Strickland operating a loosely affiliated network of thieves who worked the ranches on both sides of the territorial line. Aaron gathered information quietly, the way he had learned to gather it over 7 years as a lawman, moving through conversations and locations without announcing what he was looking for, building a picture from its pieces. But he found reasons to pass the Kingsley farm. Sometimes it was genuinely on his way. Sometimes it was not. He repaired a section of fence one afternoon in early May when he found Ida struggling alone with a post that had rotted at the base. He helped her move a piece of heavy equipment into the barn when a storm was coming from the southwest, and there was no time to wait for help. He stopped by twice just to check on Clement, who had periods of feeling better and periods of feeling considerably worse, and whose company Aaron had come to value in its own right. Ida watched all of this with her measuring green eyes and said less about it than most people would have. What she did instead was leave a covered dish of food at the jail twice in those weeks, with a note the first time that said only, "From the Kingsley farm, thank you," and no note the second time because apparently it no longer required explanation. The town noticed. Caldwell was the size at which everything was visible and most things were commented upon. Mrs. Ruth Shaughnessy, who ran the boarding house and served as an unofficial distributor of social intelligence, informed anyone who visited her that the new deputy had made himself comfortable out at the widow Kingsley's farm, using the word widow incorrectly because Ida had never been married, which Ruth knew perfectly well, but the word carried a particular narrative weight she found useful. Ida heard about this characterization and was briefly annoyed and then let it go because she had more pressing concerns. Her father took a turn for the worse in the second week of May. The doctor, a careful and mostly competent man named Dr. Elias Prout, came out to the farm and sat with Clement for an hour and emerged to speak with Ida with the particular combination of gentleness and directness that he used when the news was not good but not immediately urgent. The lungs, he said. Clement's lungs were in poor condition, a result of something that had been building for years and had accelerated over the winter. He was not dying that week, or perhaps even that month. But the trajectory was what it was, and Ida should be thinking about what needed to be arranged. Ida thanked the doctor and waited until his buggy was down the road before she sat down on the front step of the farmhouse and put her face in her hands for approximately 3 minutes. Then she stood up and went back inside. Aaron found out about Clement's condition through Holt Devereaux, who heard it from Dr. Prout, who mentioned it in passing at the barber shop. Aaron did not say anything to Ida about it directly for 2 days. He turned it over in his mind, trying to find the right way to approach it, which was not something he generally spent time doing. He was not a man who gave much thought to the right way to say things. He usually either said them plainly or did not say them at all. But with Ida, he found himself thinking more carefully about what she needed versus what he might instinctively offer, which was a distinction he had not previously been required to make. On the 3rd day, he rode out to the farm in the evening when the day's work was done. She was sitting on the front step where she apparently went to think, with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands and the sky going amber and rose over the flat land to the west. He sat down beside her without asking, and they were quiet for a moment. "I heard about your father," he said. She nodded. She did not look at him. "I am sorry," he said. "He is still here," she said. There was a quality to her voice that held everything tightly together, which he recognized as the voice of someone who had been holding things together for a long time and was very good at it and was also very tired of it. "I know he is," Aaron said, "but you are still carrying it." She looked at him then, and something in her face shifted slightly, the way a held breath shifts when it is finally released. "I do not know how not to," she said quietly. "You do not have to know how not to," he said. "You just have to let it be true for a minute without fighting it." She looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was doing something particular to the angles of his face, and she was aware, with a clarity that surprised her, that she trusted him. She was not entirely sure when that had happened. She was not a woman who trusted quickly or lightly, and she was used to being right about the pace at which she extended that trust. But somewhere between the barn roof and the supper table and these quiet evenings, she had come to trust Aaron Boone in a way that went past the gratitude of practical assistance and into something that she did not yet have a name for. She did not have a name for it yet, but she felt it, sitting there on the step with the west going all shades of red behind them. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I will come when you need me," he said. They sat together until the sky went dark. The cattle thief problem came to a head in the last week of May. Aaron had accumulated enough information about Vic Strickland's operation to know where the man staged his theft rings, which was a property 40 miles south of Caldwell, near the Kansas-Oklahoma border that was technically in disputed territory. The kind of jurisdictional gray area that men like Strickland deliberately exploited. Aaron brought his case to Holt Devereaux and also to the county sheriff, a man named Walt Osgood who had the ambition of a younger man but the caution of an older one. And after a week of planning, they organized a coordinated response that involved 6 men riding south with legal authority from 2 different offices. Ida knew about it because Aaron told her. He had not made a habit of discussing his work with civilians, but Ida had asked him one evening how the cattle thieving investigation was going, and he had answered her with more detail than he intended to, and then more detail after that, and he realized somewhere in the middle of explaining Strickland's operations that he was telling her because he wanted her to know what he did and why he did it, which meant something he was not ready to fully examine. She had listened without interrupting and then said, "Be careful. Strickland sounds like a man who would rather burn what he cannot keep than let someone else have it." She was, as it turned out, correct about that. When they rode down to the staging property and confronted Strickland and 4 of his men, Strickland lit a barn full of stolen cattle rather than surrender them. No one was killed in the fire, including the cattle, because Aaron got the barn doors open in time, which was a piece of physical luck he did not take for granted. They arrested Strickland and 2 of his men. The other 2 escaped into Oklahoma territory, and Aaron thought about pursuing them for about 2 minutes before deciding they were another jurisdiction's problem. He rode home dirty and smelling of smoke, and pulled up to the Kingsley farm at 7 in the morning, because it was on his actual way back this time. Ida came out when she heard him and looked at the smoke stains on his coat and on his face and said nothing for a moment. "Everyone alive," she said. "Everyone alive," he said. She said, "Come inside, I will make breakfast." He sat at the Kingsley kitchen table while she made eggs and salt pork and coffee, and Clement came out in his dressing gown and sat with them in the morning light, and they talked for an hour about nothing consequential. The kind of conversation that sits inside ordinary life like a piece of furniture that turns out to be load-bearing. And Aaron felt something he had not felt in years, which was the sensation of being somewhere he was supposed to be. It frightened him if he was honest with himself, which he generally was. He had not come to Caldwell looking for this. He had not come to Caldwell looking for anything except the work, which was the same arrangement he had had with every other posting since he was 24. The work was clear, and the stakes were tangible, and the results were measurable, and none of that required him to give anything of himself that he was not prepared to lose. The work kept him forward-facing, which was where he needed to be. There were things behind him that he did not look at, things that had happened in his earlier life, before the law, before Kansas, before any of this. Things that lived in the silence at the center of him and that he had decided, firmly and finally, would remain there. He had promised himself he would never speak of it. It was not a small thing he was keeping quiet. He knew that. It was the most significant thing that had ever happened to him, the thing that had remade him from the person he had been at 19 into the person he was now. And it had done that remaking through a kind of pain that he had gotten through by not looking at it too directly. The way you navigated a very bright light or a very dark room, by finding the edges rather than the center. He had spoken of it once, briefly and badly, to a man he had trusted in Wichita, and the result had been the kind of thing that confirmed what he already suspected, that some things, once spoken, cannot be managed or contained, and that the telling of them does not lighten the weight so much as it redistributes it in ways that become everyone's problem. He had decided after that to be the only person carrying it, so he carried it. He had been carrying it for 12 years, and it had shaped him the way a prevailing wind shapes a tree, bending everything in one direction so consistently that the bending becomes the shape. He did not think Ida noticed this. Most people did not notice it. They saw a man of few words and assumed the quiet was temperament rather than discipline. Ida noticed it. She had been noticing it since the barn roof, because she was the kind of person who paid attention to the whole of a thing rather than just its surface, and the whole of Aaron Boone included that silence at his center, which was not an empty silence but a full one, packed with something that was neither sad nor angry but partook of both. She did not know what it was. She did not press him about it. She was not a woman who pressed, but she was aware of it the way you are aware of weather that is holding off, something out on the horizon that has not arrived yet but that you can feel in the air. June in Caldwell was warm and busy. The cattle drive traffic through town had picked up as the season progressed, and with it came the usual constellation of trouble that accompanied large groups of young men at the end of a long trail with money in their pockets. Aaron worked long days and sometimes through the night, managing disputes and enforcing curfews, and occasionally sitting on the step outside the jail talking with Holt Devereaux about nothing in particular. The old man unwilling to admit he stayed up late because he was lonely, and Aaron unwilling to point it out. He and Ida settled into something during those weeks that did not have a formal name, but that both of them were aware of with a constant peripheral attention. He came to the farm most evenings when he could. They sat together on the front step or walked the perimeter of the property while the evening cooled, and they talked about everything except the things that mattered most, which is to say they talked about the town and the farm and Clement's health, and the book she was reading, and the political situation in the territory, and the proper way to cure a ham and 40 other subjects that were entirely real and entirely beside the point. Clement watched this from inside the farmhouse with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been fond of a good story, all his life and recognizes when he is inside one. There were two moments in June that Aaron replayed afterward more than the others. The first was an evening in early June when they had walked further than usual and found themselves at the edge of the wheat field, where the young crop was coming in thick and green in the last light, and Ida had bent down and touched the tops of the stalks with her palm in a gesture so purely affectionate that Aaron felt something in him react to it that he could not quite classify. She had looked up at him with the wheat between them and said, "My father planted this field the week we arrived. He said the land would tell him whether it wanted us here. I suppose it answered." Her voice was soft and complicated, and he was standing close enough to her to see the exact color of her eyes in the failing light, which was green like deep water, and he had wanted very badly to say something that matched the moment, and had said nothing, which was wrong, and he knew it was wrong even as he did it. She had looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the wheat. She did not push. She never pushed. But he had seen something briefly in her face that told him the silence had a cost. The second moment was a hot afternoon in the third week of June, when a confrontation outside the saloon between two cattlemen had gotten out of hand quickly, and Aaron had stepped into the middle of it and taken an elbow to the face that split his lip and knocked him sideways into the hitching post, bruising two ribs. It was not serious, but it was painful, and when he came by the farm that evening with a swollen lip and held himself carefully around the ribs, Ida had made him sit at the kitchen table and pressed a cold cloth to his face without asking permission and without making a fuss about it, and the care in her hands had been so matter-of-fact and so genuine that he had had to look away from her to maintain himself. "You should be more careful," she said. "I am always careful," he said. "There are just some situations where careful has a limited effect. Then you should carry a better positioned elbow," she said. He had laughed at that, a short and genuine laugh, and she had smiled at the sound of it with such uncomplicated warmth that he had felt the thing inside him shift again, the old wound disturbed, and the fear that came with it, and the awareness that he was losing the negotiation he had been conducting with himself since April. He stayed careful. He stayed present but not declared. He rode to her farm and sat at her table and helped with whatever needed helping and listened and talked, and gave her everything he had to give that did not require him to open the silence. Ida, for her part, was not a passive participant in what was happening between them. She had examined her own feelings with the same direct attention she brought to everything else, and had arrived at a clear conclusion, which was that she was in love with Aaron Boone. She had arrived at this conclusion sometime in the second week of June, sitting at her kitchen table at night after he had gone home, reviewing the day and finding him present in every part of it, not just in the parts where he had been physically present, but in all of it, in what she noticed and what she thought about and what she wanted to tell someone at the end of it. The someone she wanted to tell was him, which resolved the question. She was not afraid of loving him. She was afraid of the thing he was keeping from her, not because she thought it was something that would change how she felt, but because she understood that a person who is keeping something large and fundamental from the person they love is not yet fully present to that love, and she wanted all of him, not just the generous and capable surface he was so good at maintaining. She also knew she could not demand it. Whatever he was holding, he would need to choose to give it to her. She could ask once, which she planned to, but once was all she would ask. July came in hard and hot, the kind of heat that turned the prairie into a plate and the sky into a lid, and everything under it cooked slowly. Clement had a bad week in the first days of July, and then a surprisingly better week, which Dr. Prout explained was common in cases like his, the body having reserves that it released unpredictably. Clement himself said he simply decided he was not ready yet, which Ida believed and Aaron also believed when Clement told him, because Clement had the kind of will that made the distinction between a medical reality and a personal decision seem less clear than it otherwise might. Aaron had begun to understand that his assignment in Caldwell was becoming permanent in ways that had not been part of his original plan. Holt Devereaux had made it clear that he needed Aaron to stay, and the county marshal's office had concurred, and Aaron had submitted his request for a permanent appointment in late June without examining too carefully why the prospect of staying in Caldwell did not produce in him the familiar restlessness that had moved him from posting to posting over the previous 7 years. He knew why it did not produce restlessness. He knew exactly why. He was just not yet calling it by its name. On a Sunday afternoon in mid-July, he rode out to the farm and found Ida not at the house but at a spot along the creek that ran at the edge of the property, sitting on a flat rock with her shoes off and her feet in the water, and a book in her lap that she was not reading. She had told him about this spot once, that she came here when she needed to think, that the sound of the water helped. He had remembered it. He dismounted and tied his horse to a cottonwood and walked down to the creek and sat on a rock near hers, with the water between them, and neither of them said anything for a while. The creek was low with the summer heat but still moving, making its small and persistent sound, and the cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the sky above them was the hard, bright blue of Kansas in July. "I have been thinking about you," she said, still looking at the water. He looked at her. The sun was behind her and it caught her hair and turned it toward copper, and she was so much herself in that moment, so entirely and completely present in the world, that he felt the familiar fear alongside something else now, something warmer and more insistent. "I have been thinking about you too," he said. It was not very much as declarations went. But it was the truest thing he had said in months, and she heard that in it. She looked at him then, and there was a directness in her gaze that he had learned to read, the look that preceded something important. "Aaron," she said, "there is something in you that you do not say. I do not know what it is. I have not asked because I did not think it was mine to ask until I was sure of what we are to each other, and I am sure now." She paused. "I am asking now. Once. You do not have to answer, and I will not ask again, but I would like to know you, all of you." The thing inside him moved. The old silence disturbed more thoroughly now than it had been in years. He sat with it for a long moment, looking at the water, feeling the heat of the sun and the small, cool exhalation of the creek and the particular quality of what she had just offered him, which was an invitation without a demand, a door she was opening and then stepping back from. He looked at her. He looked at her face, open and honest and full of a feeling for him that he could see plainly, and that he had no desire to diminish or refuse. He thought about the promise he had made himself. He thought about the one time he had spoken of it and what had happened. He thought about how 12 years of not speaking of it had shaped him, and what that shape had cost him. He thought about sitting on this rock in the July heat with the woman he loved on the other side of the creek, offering him the chance to be fully known, and he thought about what it would mean to refuse that. "All right," he said, and then he began. He had been 19 years old. That was where it started, at the age that is old enough for everything to feel final and young enough for everything to be irreversible. He was from Missouri, a farming family in the central part of the state, and he had a brother named Daniel who was 3 years older and who had always been the stronger and steadier of the two of them in the way of older brothers, the one who knew what he was doing and communicated it without meaning to. In the autumn of 1869, when Aaron was 19 and Daniel was 22, there had been a situation with a man named Fletcher Reeves, who held a note on the Boone family farm. Reeves was not a criminal in any legal sense, but he was the kind of man who moved through the world with an eye for weakness and an instinct for how to use it, and the Boone family's weakness was financial, compounded by 2 bad harvest years and Aaron's father's declining health. Reeves had begun to make it clear that he intended to call in the note, which would mean the end of the farm and everything their parents had built in that Missouri earth over 20 years. Daniel had gone to speak with Reeves. That was the thing that started the sequence. Daniel had gone alone, which was his way, to handle it himself without involving Aaron or their parents, because Daniel was the older brother and that was what older brothers did. He went in late October on a cold afternoon. He did not come home. They found him 3 days later. He had been shot once at close range and left in a dry creek bed 2 miles from Reeves's property. There were no witnesses. Reeves had 2 men who would testify he had been at home all evening. The county sheriff at the time was a man who had reasons of his own to extend Reeves the benefit of every available doubt. The investigation was brief, and its conclusions were insufficient. Aaron sat at his kitchen table and looked at this. He was 19 years old and his brother was dead, and the man who had done it was walking around free, and the law had failed in every way a law can fail. He had no money, no influence, and no formal standing. He had a grief so large and a rage so clean that it had reorganized everything inside him into something new and very cold and very clear. He spent 6 months gathering what evidence he could. He was methodical about it, more methodical than a 19-year-old with no training ought to have been. But grief can produce that in a person. It can turn the mind to a kind of focused instrument. He found a woman who had seen Reeves's horse on the road that evening. He found a man who had heard Reeves say something about Daniel Boone's visit the day before. He found discrepancies in the testimony of Reeves's men that he documented carefully and brought to a different official, a circuit judge who passed through the county in April of 1870. The judge reviewed his materials. The case was reopened. Fletcher Reeves was arrested in May of 1870 and stood trial in August of that same year. He was convicted of the killing of Daniel Boone and sentenced to 20 years at the Missouri State Penitentiary. Aaron was 20 years old when that verdict came down. He sat in that courtroom and listened to it and felt something leave him that had been sustaining him for over a year, the purposeful cold fury that had kept him organized and moving. What was left after it went was an extraordinary and somewhat terrifying emptiness, and inside the emptiness was the grief that the purpose had been holding off, and it was larger than he had anticipated. He could not go back to the farm. He tried for a month and could not do it. Every part of that land was his brother. He sold his portion to a neighboring family with his parents' blessing and his mother's tears, and left Missouri with the clothes on his back and a general direction west. He was not running exactly. He was looking for something to do that would fill the emptiness with purpose, because that was the mechanism he had discovered worked. He found the law. It was not accidental. He had learned in his pursuit of justice for Daniel that he was good at the particular combination of patience and directness and physical capability that good law work required, and that the work had a moral clarity he needed. He went to Kansas and found a marshal who needed a deputy and did not ask too many questions about experience. And he was good at it from the beginning, and he had been good at it for 11 years, and he had organized his entire life around being good at it. He had never gone back to Missouri. His mother had died in 1877. His father had died in 1875. He had not been there for either. He carried that alongside the other thing, the weight of Daniel, and it was all part of the silence. He had not spoken of Daniel to another living person since the day he left Missouri. Not the grief, not the anger, not the 6 months of methodical pursuit, not the moment in the courtroom. It was his, and he kept it, and it was the thing that had made him and unmade him and remade him into the person sitting on this rock in Kansas in July of 1882. He told Ida all of it. He told her the way you tell someone when you have decided, finally and completely, to tell them. Without management, without the careful omissions that protect the teller. He told her about Daniel's face and Daniel's laugh, and the way Daniel could throw a rope, and the particular sound of Daniel's boots on the kitchen floor. He told her about the dry creek bed and what it looked like, and what it felt like to stand in it. He told her about the cold fury and the judge and the verdict and the extraordinary emptiness after. He told her about leaving Missouri and about his mother and father, and about all the years since that had been competent and useful and genuine, but that had been built on a foundation of never looking directly at the thing he had built them on. He talked for a long time. The sun moved. The shadows of the cottonwoods shifted and stretched across the water. The creek made its small sound beneath all of it, Ida did not interrupt him. She did not offer comfort in the middle of it or reactions that would redirect him. She simply listened with her entire self, her green eyes on his face, fully present to every word. When he had finished, the sun was low, sitting on the rim of the prairie about 2 hours from full dark, doing everything it does to the western sky when it is serious about a sunset. All that red and gold laid out flat and vast and indifferent to whatever small human things were happening beneath it. Aaron stopped talking. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the water. He had told her everything before sunset. The promise he had kept for 12 years, broken quietly and completely in the space of one July afternoon. Ida was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was low and careful. "He sounds like someone worth fighting for," she said. Not, "How terrible," or "You poor man," or any of the other constructions that would have made it about sympathy and comfort and the management of his grief. Just, "He sounds like someone worth fighting for," reaching past the tragedy to the love that had motivated it, naming the thing that made it worth carrying. Aaron looked at her. Something in him released that he had not known was still clenched. "He was," Aaron said. His voice was rougher than usual. "And you have carried him alone for 12 years, she said. "I thought it was the only way to carry it," he said. "It was the only way you knew," she said. "That is different." He looked at her for a long time, this woman on her rock in the creek light, with the sunset pouring over both of them like something being poured out, and he thought about how the telling of it had not broken anything, had not distributed the weight badly, had not become everyone's problem. He thought about how wrong he had been about that, and how the wrongness of it was something he felt in his chest like pressure being released, like a joint long out of place finding its socket. "Come here," she said, and held out her hand across the water, and he stood up and stepped into the shallow creek and crossed it and took her hand, and she stood up from her rock, and there they were in the last gold of the evening with the water running over their feet. And he put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in the particular serious way of a person who has been thinking about doing something for months and has finally decided that the cost of not doing it is higher than the cost of doing it. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and the cottonwoods moved in the evening air, and the water ran over their feet, and that was how it was settled between them. They told Clement that evening at supper. Aaron sat at the kitchen table and said clearly that he had intentions toward Ida, that he wanted to be straightforward about it, and that he hoped Clement would be willing to speak with him about it more formally when the occasion allowed. Clement looked at Aaron over his coffee cup and then looked at Ida and then looked back at Aaron and said, "I was beginning to wonder how long it would take you," which made Ida laugh and Aaron feel, again, that unreasonable warmth he was going to have to stop being surprised by. August was a different month than the ones before it. The difference was not dramatic. Nothing in their daily lives changed structurally. They were not yet married, and the proprieties of 1882 in a Kansas cattle town had to be observed. But there was something unclenched in Aaron now that changed the texture of everything. He laughed more readily. He offered opinions without the prior filter of necessary caution. He was still a man of few words, that was temperament rather than discipline, but the words he offered now came from the whole of him rather than the carefully managed portion he had been presenting. Ida felt the change in him, and it moved her profoundly. She had believed in the person he was before, but the person he was now, the one who had told her everything before sunset and had not broken apart in the telling, who had kissed her in the creek and said Daniel's name out loud in the evening sometimes, with a grief that was present and named rather than hidden and accumulated. This person was someone she loved with a fullness that she thought she might never have an adequate expression for. She tried, sometimes in the evenings. She would say, "I love all of you, not just what you let people see." And he would look at her with that thing in his dark eyes that was not comfortable emotion, but was something deeper and truer than comfort, and he would say, "I know." And she understood that this was as close to adequate as language was going to get. He proposed on a September evening at the creek, which was where the significant things between them happened. He did it plainly and without ceremony, the way he did most things, sitting beside her on the flat rock with the water lower now, the summer heat having done its work on it, and he said, "I would like to marry you, Ida. I would like to spend my life with you, and I am asking you to let me." She said yes before he finished the sentence. They were married in October of 1882, on a bright cold morning, in the small church where Ida had been attending more regularly since the spring, the minister making note privately that Miss Kingsley's increased church attendance had apparently been connected to a longer strategy than simple piety. It was a small wedding, Holt Devereux standing up for Aaron with visible pride, and the Kingsley farm neighbors filling most of the pews, and Clement sitting in the front row in his good suit, looking like a man who had gotten something right. Aaron carried Daniel in his heart through the ceremony the way you carry the dead when there is something worth marking, with the specific attention of bringing them present to a moment they would have wanted to be part of. He thought, during the exchange of vows, that Daniel would have liked Ida enormously, and that Daniel would have had something to say about how long Aaron had taken to get here, something fond and dry and entirely accurate. After the ceremony, standing outside in the October cold with Ida's hand in his and the town milling around them with the good-natured noise of a community event, Aaron felt something complete in himself for the first time in a very long time. Not fixed, not repaired in the way a broken thing is repaired and shows the repair. Complete in the way something is complete when all its pieces are present and acknowledged, including the damaged ones, including the missing ones. They moved into the farmhouse with Clement, who was fiercely glad of Aaron's company and continued to have his good weeks and his less good weeks. And the winter of 1882 into 1883 passed in a way that Ida would later describe as the best winter of her life, which surprised people who knew how cold Kansas could be. The farm was small and warm, and they were all together in it, and Aaron learned from Clement about the history of the land, and about Illinois, and about Ida as a child, and Ida learned from the absence of tension in Aaron things about what he had been before she knew him and was glad he was not anymore. Clement died in February of 1883, on a night when the snow was deep and the house was warm, and Aaron was sitting in the chair beside his bed reading to him from a novel they had been working through together for several weeks. He went quietly, between one breath and the next, with Aaron's hand in his and Ida standing at the foot of the bed. They had known it was close. They had been with him for it, which was what he had wanted, and they gave it to him. Ida grieved her father fully and without management, which Aaron recognized as the healthiest possible thing, and which he supported in the most practical ways he knew how, by being present and steady, and by not trying to fix what was not fixable, only by sitting in it alongside her the way she had sat in things alongside him. Spring came as it always comes to the Kansas prairie, suddenly and with complete commitment. The wheat came up on the field that Clement had planted in the first week of their arrival, which Aaron now worked alongside the hired man they had been able to bring on after the winter, a steady young man from Nebraska named George Prather, who was capable and reliable and did not disappear during difficult seasons. Aaron was formally appointed permanent marshal of Caldwell in April of 1883. Holt Devereux having retired that February with the air of a man who had earned his rest and intended to collect it thoroughly. Aaron accepted the appointment with the same combination of commitment and clear-eyed practicality he brought to everything, and Caldwell accepted him in return with the confidence of a town that had seen what it looked like when someone actually did the job well. He was good at it. The town had calmed considerably from the previous year, partly because the Strickland network had been dismantled, and partly because Aaron's presence had a quieting effect that was not about intimidation, exactly, but about the communication that certain standards were going to be maintained, and that maintaining them was personally important to the man doing the maintaining. He was fair and he was consistent and he was not afraid, which was the combination that worked. The spring and summer of 1883 had their own quality. Aaron and Ida were finding their rhythm as a married couple, which involved some negotiation, as it always does, between the practical habits of two people who had organized their lives independently and now had to organize them together. Ida had firm views about how the farm accounts should be kept. Aaron had firm views about almost nothing domestic except the necessity of hot coffee in the morning, which she provided without complaint. She thought he spent too much time at the office on evenings when nothing was actively happening. He thought she pushed herself too hard during planting season without asking for adequate help. They said these things to each other directly, which was the only way either of them knew how to say things, and they resolved them without drama, which was the only way either of them knew how to resolve things. They were also, underneath all the practical negotiation, besotted with each other in the way of people who came to something important late and are aware of it. Aaron looked at Ida across the kitchen table in the mornings, with an attention that had never been given to a kitchen table before. Ida touched the back of his hand when she passed him sometimes for no reason except that she wanted to, and he turned his hand to hold hers without thinking about it, which was the particular habit of touch that develops in couples who trust each other completely. She told him things about her childhood in Illinois that she had never told anyone else, the difficulties of being a woman with opinions in a community that preferred women with deference, the books that had sustained her, the friendship she had had with a girl named Clara who had died of fever at 16, and whose absence had shaped Ida in ways she was still discovering. Aaron listened to all of it with the same quality of full attention that she had given him at the creek. He had learned from her example what full listening looked like, which was one of the things she had given him without naming it as a gift. He began to write letters to Missouri. Not to anyone in particular, there was no one left from his immediate family, but to the county where he had grown up, inquiring about records, about the small farmhouse that had been sold, about whether there was a marker for Daniel anywhere. There was. Daniel was buried in a country cemetery outside the town, and the marker had been maintained by the family that had bought the farm, which was a kindness Aaron had not expected, and which undid him briefly when he read it in the letter. He told Ida about the marker. She suggested they go to Missouri the following spring when the farm could be managed without them for a week. He said he would think about it. He thought about it for 2 days and then said yes, which was faster than he had expected, and he understood that the telling had made this possible, that the woman who had asked him once and received everything before sunset had given him back a relationship to his own history that he had renounced and that he now wanted to recover. In the autumn of 1883, Ida told him she was pregnant. He was standing in the kitchen doorway when she told him, having just come in from the yard, and the evening light was behind her, and she said it simply because she was always simple about important things. And he stood in the doorway and felt the news enter him like a key turning in a lock that had been there all along. And he crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took her in his arms and held her there for a long time without saying anything at all, which she understood perfectly. She asked him when he had let her go and they were sitting at the table what he hoped for. He said what any honest person says, which is health, just health. She asked if he had a preference. He said, after thinking about it, that he wanted a son. He said it quietly and without embarrassment, and she knew without him saying it that the son was connected to Daniel, to the idea of something continued, and she held his hand across the table and said, "Then let us hope." The son was born in the spring of 1884, on an April morning that was warm and bright and full of the sounds of the Kansas spring, birds and wind, and the distant low of cattle, all of it coming through the window of the farmhouse bedroom where Ida labored with a determination that impressed even Dr. Prout, who had attended a great many births and was not easily impressed. They named him Daniel James Boone. Daniel for the brother, James for Clement Kingsley's middle name, which was a decision Ida had made and Aaron had received with a gratitude that went beyond what he knew how to say. So he said it simply and directly, which was his way, and she understood. Daniel James Boone was a large and noisy infant who communicated his preferences about the world with great energy and complete clarity, and who by the time he was 3 weeks old had the particular look of a person who is going to have opinions and intends to make them known. Aaron held his son in the evenings with an expression that the town of Caldwell, watching Aaron Boone carry his son on his rounds, found surprisingly affecting in a marshal who had previously been characterized as a man of considerable reserve. He was still a man of considerable reserve. He was also a man who stood in the wheat field on an April evening and held his son up toward the sky and said Daniel's name aloud in a way that was neither grief nor prayer exactly, but something that partook of both, a calling across time toward the person this new life was partially named for. And Ida, watching from the fence, felt a love for him so complete and so clear that it had stopped feeling like an emotion and had become more like weather, like the air around her, the thing she moved through. The spring trip to Missouri happened in May of 1884, with Daniel James safely in George Prather's competent supervision for the week. Aaron and Ida rode the train east, which was a journey neither of them had made in years, watching the land change from the flat open prairie to the more rolling and wooded Missouri country that Aaron had grown up in and not seen in 14 years. He was quiet for most of the train journey, but it was the new quiet, the inhabited quiet, the kind where Ida could feel him thinking and being in it rather than the old sealed quiet that had kept her outside. They went to the cemetery on the second day. It was a small country churchyard with the particular quality of rural cemeteries in the Midwest, modest and honest, the markers simple, and the grass kept without flourish. Daniel Boone was buried in the third row, and the stone was modest but well kept, and Aaron stood in front of it for a long time with Ida's hand in his, and said nothing that she could hear and possibly said things she could not. She gave him the time it required, which was considerable, and when he finally turned away his face was rough with emotion in a way she had not seen before, not broken but open, the grief present and named and moving through him rather than held behind the sealed wall, and she thought, that is 12 years of holding finally put down. That is a weight set on the ground rather than carried. Good, good. He is allowed to set it down. They spent the rest of the week in the Missouri countryside, seeing the farm he had grown up on, now a flourishing family property under the family that had bought it, who showed them around graciously, and without question when Aaron explained who he was and what the place had meant to him. He stood in the kitchen where Daniel's boots had sounded on the floor, and it was both smaller and larger than memory, the way childhood places always are, and Ida stood in it with him and let it be what it was. They rode home on the train with the Missouri spring behind them and the Kansas prairie ahead, and Aaron slept for part of the journey with his head resting back and his face completely still, the particular sleep of a person who has set something down. Ida read her book and watched the land and felt profoundly, quietly glad of all of it. Back in Caldwell, the summer of 1884 was eventful in the productive rather than troublesome sense. The town had grown somewhat, a new mercantile had opened, the school had been expanded, and there was serious talk of a proper bank being established which would be a significant indicator of civic stability. Aaron's reputation had continued to develop in the way reputations develop when they are deserved, and there were inquiries from other counties about his availability that he declined with the brevity of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. Ida had taken on a small but regular role in the town's civic life, which had surprised some people and surprised no one who knew her. She had helped establish a small lending library in the back of the general store, working with the store's owner, a woman named Mrs. Faulkner who shared her passion for books, and the library had become a quietly important institution in the town's daily life. She was also, by the summer of 1884, a source of advice and assistance to several of the farm families in the area who were navigating the particular difficulties of drought conditions that had hit the region that year. Her own farm's methods having produced results that other farms were interested in understanding. The drought was real and it was hard, and Aaron watched the families around Caldwell navigate it with a combination of official and unofficial support that he worked hard to facilitate. There were families who were going to lose their farms if the next season did not improve, and there were men and women in Caldwell who could help and who needed to be organized into helping, which turned out to be something Aaron was also good at: the practical coordination of community resources, a skill he had not known he had until he needed it. He and Ida had long conversations in the evenings about the farm families in difficulty, about what the federal land policies were doing to small farmers in the territory, about the particular injustice of a system that offered land to settlers and then provided minimal support when the conditions of that land proved brutal. These were not idle conversations. They produced plans and letters and actions, Aaron using his official position to advocate with county officials, and Ida using her practical knowledge to help neighboring farms implement methods that made better use of limited water. It was the kind of partnership that was satisfying in a very specific way, the way working alongside someone whose capabilities complement your own and whose values match yours is satisfying. It made the daily effort feel like it added up to something. Daniel James, growing into an energetic toddler with his father's dark eyes and his mother's green ones, somehow, the genetics of it surprising everyone, was the particular joy of Aaron's daily life that he had not anticipated being the kind of person to experience. He had thought of himself as suited to solitary satisfactions. He turned out to be wrong about that, which he counted, privately, as one of the better mistakes of his life. He sat with Daniel in the evenings after the boy was fed and before he slept, and he talked to him in the way people talk to infants and toddlers who do not yet understand words but understand cadence and tone and presence. And what Aaron talked about, more than any other subject, was his namesake. He told the boy about Daniel Boone, the first Daniel, with a specificity and affection that had come only recently, as though the 12 years of keeping it sealed had concentrated the memory, and the opening of it had released something distilled and true. The boy in his arms did not understand a word of it. Aaron told him anyway. He told him about the rope and the walk and the kitchen floor. Ida overheard these bedside monologues sometimes from the doorway and never interrupted them. They were not for her, exactly, though she received them. They were for both Daniels, the one in Aaron's arms and the one in the Missouri earth, and she left them to each other. The second pregnancy came in the winter of 1885. Ida told Aaron on a cold evening when the fire was going and Daniel James was asleep and the farmhouse was as warm and settled as a house could be, and Aaron said immediately and without thinking, "Another boy." He said it with such certainty that Ida raised an eyebrow and he had the decency to look slightly embarrassed and say, "Or a girl." Either. Both healthy. It was a girl. She arrived in August of 1885, on a hot and busy morning, also with lungs she was not shy about using. They named her Clara, for Ida's childhood friend from Illinois, and Clara Boone was dark-haired and had the family's intensity of expression from her very first weeks, looking at the world with the focused regard of someone who has arrived somewhere important and intends to understand it thoroughly. Daniel James was 17 months old when Clara arrived and reacted to her with the benign indifference of a toddler who has not yet understood that she represents a permanent change in the household's attention allocation, followed by a period of adjustment, and then a settled acceptance that had evolved, by the time both children were walking, into the beginning of a genuine sibling companionship that Aaron and Ida watched with the particular pleasure of parents who had hoped for exactly this. The town of Caldwell continued its growth and its complications through the mid-1880s. The cattle trade was changing. The great trail drives were beginning to feel the pressure of the expanding railroad network, and the new fencing practices that were transforming the open range. And with that change came a shift in the town's character, less rough and transient, more settled and civic. Aaron navigated these shifts with the same pragmatic intelligence he brought to everything, understanding that the law that a town needed changed as the town changed, and adjusting his practice accordingly. He had a deputy now, a young man named Cal Brennan who was from Texas and was 22, and had the makings of a good lawman if he could get past the particular vanities of 22 that were the obstacle between where he was and where he needed to be. Aaron worked with him patiently and directly, which was the only way Aaron worked with anyone, and Cal responded to it the way capable people respond to being treated with respect and given real responsibility, with a growing competence that was gratifying. There was a difficult situation in 1886 that Aaron dealt with largely on his own, and that was the kind of situation that reminded him why the work still mattered regardless of how much the town had settled. A family east of town, the Webbers, had had their property claim challenged by a large cattle operation that was trying to consolidate land through a combination of legal pressure and extra-legal intimidation, which was a practice that was unfortunately common in the territories, and that Aaron had encountered in various forms over his years as a lawman. He spent 6 weeks working through the legal and practical dimensions of the Weber situation, filing counterclaims on their behalf, and making the cost of the intimidation tactics high enough that the cattle operation decided the land was not worth the effort. The Webbers were not wealthy, and they were not influential, and they had no reason to expect that the law would work effectively on their behalf. Aaron thought about this. He thought about it from the specific vantage point of a man who had once been 19 years old and poor and powerless, and in need of someone who would simply do their job well and fairly. He thought about how it had taken him 6 months and a great deal of luck to find someone who would, and he thought about how that should not have been the case, and about how making it less the case was something that was within his actual power to do in this town on this day in the world as it currently was. He told Ida about the Weber situation one evening. She listened and said, "I am glad you did that," he said. "I should have done it faster," she said. "You did it. That is what matters." That was the kind of conversation they had. By 1887, Caldwell had a functioning bank, 3 churches, 2 schools, a doctor's office. That Dr. Pruitt had expanded into a small surgery, and a population that had grown considerably from the town Aaron had ridden into in April of 1882. The prairie around it had changed too, more fenced, more cultivated, the great open quality of the early cattle drive years giving way to something more domestic and complex. Aaron felt the change without mourning it, understanding that change was the nature of frontier places, that the wildness was always a condition of passage rather than permanence, and that what came after it was either justice or injustice depending on who was paying attention. He was paying attention. He intended to keep paying attention. Daniel James was 4 years old in the spring of 1888 and had developed into a person of considerable and cheerful energy, who could be found at any given moment, either following his father around the farm, with the focused attention of an apprentice, or sitting in his mother's lap being read to, with the absorbed expression of someone who knows that books contain worlds and is eager to get into them. He had Aaron's physical quality of stillness when he was thinking and Ida's quality of full presence when he was with you, and the combination was already, at 4, the beginning of someone who was going to be fine in the world. Clara was 2.5 and was a person of strong opinions clearly expressed, a quality that Ida recognized with wry familiarity and Aaron found consistently surprising and delightful. She had decided that horses were the most important animals and that George Prather should give her lessons, a view she communicated to George directly and with great firmness, and George, who had a younger sister of his own, began giving her lessons. The summer of 1888 was one of those summers that seems designed to confirm a life's direction. The wheat came in well after 2 years of difficult conditions. The farm was sound. The children were healthy. Aaron's work was meaningful and manageable, and continued to produce results that made the town a better place. He and Ida were in their 7th year together, counting from the creek, and the love between them had that quality that the best long loves have, of being simultaneously completely familiar and continuously surprising, each of them still capable of saying something that made the other see something new, still capable of startling each other with a gesture or a recognition. They sat on the front step one September evening, the children in bed and the night warm and full of stars, and the sound of the prairie settling into itself after the day's heat. It had become a habit, the front step, replacing the creek as their particular place for the evenings when they needed to sit with each other without the interior of the house around them. Aaron said, out of a comfortable silence, "I have been thinking about Daniel." She knew which Daniel. She said, "Tell me." He said, "I thought for a long time that carrying his memory alone was the way I honored him, that the keeping of it was the respect I owed him." He paused, looking at the stars. "But I think now that the keeping was not honor. It was just grief that had gone rigid. What honors him is this." He gestured at the house behind them, the dark windows of the children's room, the farm beyond. "What he would have wanted for me, which is this." Ida leaned into him, her shoulder against his arm. "Yes," she said quietly, "that is exactly right." He turned and kissed the top of her head, and she closed her eyes for a moment, and let that be the whole world, the warm night and the stars and the man beside her who had told her everything before sunset on a July afternoon, and had been telling her things ever since. A man remade into his full self by the particular courage of speaking and the particular grace of being heard. "I want to go back to Missouri again," he said, "with the children. When Daniel James is old enough to understand something of it." "We will," she said. "We will go and show them where your family comes from. We will tell them about their Uncle Daniel and about your mother and father, and they will know where they come from, all of it." "Yes," he said, "all of it." The night was very quiet and very large around them, the prairie doing what it always did in September, going a little gold at the edges, beginning its turn toward autumn, and in the farmhouse behind them the children slept and the house held them all. They remained on the step for a long time, the way you remain in places that are good to you, not because you are afraid of moving, but because the present is so completely itself that you want to give it all the time it deserves. Aaron looked at the stars and thought about Daniel, the first Daniel, with a grief that was present and clean and companion now, no longer a thing he carried alone in the sealed center of himself. He thought about Ida asking him once at the creek in the July heat, with the cottonwoods moving and the water over their feet, and about what it had cost him to answer and what the answer had given him back. He had promised himself he would never speak of it. She had asked once. He had told her everything before sunset. And what had come after that, the woman beside him, the children in the house, the farm on its gentle rise, the town in his care, the work that mattered, the life that was fully and completely his in all its parts, had given him more than the keeping of the promise ever could have. He reached over without looking and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his with the ease of long habit and continued companionship. And there they sat together in the vast Kansas night, the two of them, with everything they had built and everything still ahead of them, as present and as complete as it is possible for two people to be. 3 years later, in 1891, they did make the trip to Missouri with the children. Daniel James was 7 and Clara was 5, and they stood at the grave in the country churchyard while Aaron explained, clearly and carefully, who Daniel Boone had been, and why his name lived now in a 7-year-old boy in Kansas, who had his great-uncle's seriousness about ropes and his mother's green eyes. Daniel James listened with the focused intensity he brought to everything his father told him. Clara put a handful of wildflowers she had picked from the roadside on the grave, with the decisive generosity of 5 years old. Aaron stood at that grave for the second time and felt the full weight of the life behind him and the life ahead, and he was grateful, precisely and specifically, for all of it. He was also grateful for a day in July of 1882 when a woman had sat on a rock in a creek and asked him once, simply and without demand, to let himself be known, and for his own decision, finally made, to honor that offer with everything he had. They rode home from Missouri as the autumn was beginning to show at the edges of things, the two children asleep against each other on the train seat across from them, small and completely trusting and utterly themselves, the products of a love that had been built honestly on the foundation of two people who had decided to tell each other the truth. Aaron looked at Ida across the train car, and she looked back at him, and between them was everything that needed to be there and nothing that did not. "Thank you," he said. She knew what he was thanking her for. She always knew. She smiled at him with the full warmth of it. "Come here," she said, the same two words she had said at the creek, and he moved across and sat beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and outside the train the Missouri countryside gave way to the open Kansas land, flat and wide and honest, going on in every direction as far as you could see. The children slept. The land moved past. The stars came out as the train carried them west toward home. And Marshal Aaron Boone of Caldwell, Kansas, husband to Ida Kingsley Boone, father of Daniel James and Clara, a man who had been remade by loss and rebuilt by love, rode home at last in possession of the life he had been carrying toward since a July afternoon when a woman asked him once, and he told her everything before sunset, and found, in the telling, not the weight he feared but the freedom he had not known he needed. The extraordinary, ordinary freedom of being wholly and completely known by someone who loves you and is not afraid of what they find. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything.